My guest today on the Brand Tune podcast is Sean Adams, who is an internationally recognized graphic designer and the chair of undergraduate and graduate graphic design at Art Center College of Design in California. He is the author of multiple best-selling books, including The Designer's Dictionary of Color and How Design Makes Us Think. Adams is an on-screen instructor for LinkedIn Learning and contributor to Design Observer. He is the only two-term national president of the American Institute of Graphic Arts, AGA, which is a 100-year-old professional organization for design. In 2014, Adams was awarded the AGA Medal, which is the highest honor in the profession. Previously, Adams was a founding partner of Adams Morioch, a design agency. Sean, welcome to the Brand Tune podcast. I'm delighted that you agreed to start this interview by delivering a 10-minute mini masterclass. I understand it's on how to succeed with identities without really trying.
Yes, absolutely, Sharon. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, although I wish I could be there in person with you. It'd be a far more fun trip. But yes, I actually thought I'd start off with just a really brief overview of identity design, and not only for us as designers, but for those of us that are working as clients, to understand sort of the process and what works and what doesn't, and why we sometimes make the choices that we do. So it's less of a fuzzy, magical, mystical trip that we're on, and something more realistic.
Yeah, it would be lovely to demystify it.
Yeah. So let me share my screen and
let me enable you to do that. Sorry.
No problem. You're far ahead of me if you can figure out how to do it.
Yeah, you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay, perfect. So now theoretically, you should have the correct slide, right? How to succeed with identities.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Now let me go through this briefly. And of course, you know, in real life, this would take 14 weeks at a normal course with us at Art Center. We're going to pretend, as you'd mentioned, let's presume the research and strategy are all done, that we've done this part of it already. We're ready to start making form at this point.
Yeah.
So we've already looked at the brand as a whole. We've understood like all of the pieces come together. It's not just the identity that is reinforcing the message. We've looked at all of the points of contact so that we know that whatever we make is going to have to work in print or in a tiny pixel on social media, that we understand the issues that are involved with just the technical part of this. And we know who our audience is. Clients tend to love to say, my audience is everybody, which is a rather broad statement, and tends to, include people probably not part of your audience. So it's good to really know, like, who's my core audience and work out from there, because then I know who I'm talking to and how to communicate to them.
Yeah.
We've also looked at the competition, so we understand who is our direct competition and who's the primary and secondary, and maybe in 5 years, who's that going to be, and really what's making our brand unique. Now, one thing I always do with all of my clients is really make them button down several attributes so that it's not just this fuzzy, I think we're about X. Tell me, boil this down. And sometimes this takes a good month of back and forth, because everyone starts off with, oh, our attribute is quality and excellence. Okay, who isn't? Could we please, just like find something a little bit more specific? So once we've gotten there, we have something to work with. I also go over my rules of identity design with my clients. I find that they, you need to be an expert to understand some of this stuff, and you have to explain it to them. And one of the most important things that clients typically don't understand is that good logos identify. It's their job to identify. It's like your name. It's like your name is Shireen. It doesn't tell me anything about you. It just tells me who you are. When you try to describe what they do, it leads to bad things. And that the logo isn't going to solve every problem. It has to be engaging. It should be memorable. A good logo will always pose a question. If you think about the Apple identity, it has that little bite out of it, which just forces you to think a little bit. The more you think, the more it sticks in your head. And it has to be neutral enough to adapt to changes, which is the whole point of identifying. If IBM had started off with a picture of their little machine, their adding machine, they could never be what they are today. So it's good to have a sense of like it's neutral. It can do lots of different things. I then try to go through just some basics with them, as in like, well, there's really three kinds of identities, and it's good to explore all of these. That that there's not just one solution typically. So there's the word mark, which is the name, put into some sort of letter forms that are proprietary. A monogram, like IBM, which is International Business Machines, or symbol, like the CBSI, when CBS switched from radio to television and wanted to make sure people understood it's visual now. You can see things. A word mark can encompass a lot. Just the word mark Disney, we have emotional responses to it, and it does a great job of being clearly understandable immedately. I know what that is. The downside with a word mark is that it's maybe not as universal. That Disney will sort of work everywhere, but if another a less global brand might have trouble in Korea or somewhere where the letter forms are completely different. There's a monogram, NASA, National Aerospace Space Association, or whatever, the long version of it. And monograms are great when you've got one of those uber long names that no one's going to remember. Like International Business Machines, it's just not that fun. So, the idea with NASA is it's a very quick, easy read. The downside with monograms is that there are a lot of them, and people tend to just just make monogram of my name, SA. Well, there's a lot of SAs, so it's a little hard to own that, and take some time. And there's a symbol, so there's a symbol like British Rail. It's like, I understand that means something. Now, you understand that's British Rail, and I understand it's British Rail, but without repeated exposure to that symbol, it may be unclear what it is. It's great, it's universal, we all get it, but does it read to everybody? And that takes time. That takes a lot of effort to get someone to recognize just a pure symbol. The logo or the lockup is usually a word mark connected with that symbol. So the CBSI with the CBS Firmandito, which is their typeface, combined make the CBS logo. Or the Apple computer, this is the old Apple logo, and they ran with that word underneath that logo for a good 25 years. So for 25 years, they're pounding that connection into us. Now it's gone far enough along that they can move the word and we still know what it means. McDonald's just did the same thing. They just removed McDonald's from their golden arches, and now it's just the arches because they've got enough equity in that identity at this point to be able to pull that off. Now, the process is the part that I really like to take my clients along with. I don't like the idea of I'm working off by myself doing some magic thing and then I reveal my wonder. I want them to be part of this. It's collaborative. They're going to know their business better than I ever will. I can point out some things I might see from the outside, but it's their business. They know things intuitively I may not know. And it's good to, incorporate that. Now, almost every project I've started with, someone has walked in with a really bad logo idea. Like they're just immediately like, hey, what if we did X? And you're like, how do I get around this? Now, one of the things that I find that clients do, and a lot of designers too, is they just jump immediately to what everyone else is doing. So showing them that really helps clarify the issue. So for example, this was a board that I made for an identity system for a library foundation. And, initially they were like, oh, well, we can have books or a tree. And I'm like, there's a lot of books and trees out there. Let's really look at that, because if you want to stand out, you're going to have to actually maybe go away from what everyone else is doing. And that is the point, is to be proprietary and stand out, not blend in any way. And then one of my personal pet peeves are these logos with people. They drive me to madness. They're like 50% of the people I work with are at some point saying, what if there's a logo of people like this? And like, why? Like, why? And there's so many bad logos of these strange, shadow people that are out there. And so again, I try to show them these are not logos, these are illustrations. These are really just cute drawings of something. And if you use people, you're opening yourself up to all kinds of misinterpretations. This always does the job of ending that story right there. Like when you show them, look, you make the one wrong choice here, and you've really gone down a bad street without intending to. And typically they're like, oh my, I had no idea that it could go wrong so quickly. So in exploring a word mark, and this is a very truncated version of what we do, I'll go through the process of looking at lots and lots of different typefaces. To be honest with you, it's not wildly scientific at this point. It's just, I'm looking at form, which words fit, which letters fit together well. Is there anything that doesn't work and feels weird? And typography is pictures of words. So what is this picture? How does it make me feel? What's the tone? And I might go through hundreds of these, and I might share that with the client too. And so someone's like, well, did you try something like this? Yes, it's right here. What do you think? And then I can narrow it down, from, okay, I've decided I like this letter form's the best, but how can I make that proprietary? Because I find that, if you have a typeface or a logo that's just a typeface, someone will try to type it in on their own, and it will be Times Roman. And you're like, that's not our logo. That's, just our name in Times Roman. So getting in there and making some modifications. In this instance, the A has been modified and the R has been modified, and the ampersand, so that it's not just a typeface any longer. And then monograms, I may try. Now, typically people that make monograms that are tortured typography. They're just like, please don't do this to me. If it doesn't fit together easily, don't do it. There's a reason why. And again, it's like, how can I combine specific letter forms? Do they work? Do they not work? Is it going to look scary? Is it going to look, friendly? What are the attributes that I'm trying to convey here? And how can I put them together? And in this instance, I could look at it and say, well, this is lovely, but I have no idea what it is. It's just too broad. I don't, there's the brand name doesn't have enough equity in it. And then developing a symbol or an icon, I always go back to the original attributes. These are the attributes we agreed upon: historic, personal, classic. These are the things this brand is about. So what are symbols that can represent these things? Like, what are some ways I might want to talk about it? So I'm going to develop a set of symbols based on that. It's historic. Does a quill pen work? It's about comfortable. Does this sort of Princess and the Pea identity kind of a concept work? Or it's personal. So the peacock kind of a flat, what are the symbols that might have some resonance with this? Now, in this instance, with this brand Meander, it kind of boiled down to this building structure because it was historic, and just I think it's always a good idea to work with a little bit of structure. So this is the golden rectangle that I worked within when building starting to refine the logo, just to give it some form that had some meaning to it. And from there, you're refining. At that point, I'm taking all of my different icons, or the ones that I like the best, and combining them with the different typefaces that I like the best, that seem to convey the best message. And once again, sharing that with the client so that they see, oh, this typeface with this icon works great. This one doesn't look so good. These don't pair as well. Now, in the instance of Meander, I went back to the real place. That kept coming back over and over again. It's a historic inn. Why aren't we using the real place? And eventually, it just became great. We can represent the form itself with a variation of the building. It's not an illustration of the building. It's the idea of the building, which is actually a Jeffersonian structure. So, putting those things together worked great. From there, it's fine-tuning the identity itself so that there are reasons for the spacing. And proportion is magic. Proportion makes things fit together harmoniously. I look at the competition and their color systems and try to figure out how can we do something different so that I'm not copying every other inn in the neighborhood, but let's Meander, stand out as being cool color. Build an entire visual system. So there's a logo, there's color palette, type of typefaces that are to be used, and sometimes images that might go along with it. And then I can apply it. Then it's a matter of okay, showing the client, this is how it's going to work. This is often the thing that sort of sells the car. Now you see this works. I can fit it on a website. I can also put it on some soap if I have to, that it can reduce down to that. And it can still function, as signage in any kind of a setting, that it's broad enough to do that. So that's the process very, very quickly, just to walk through. And hopefully I got that in under 10 minutes.
Great, thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So a lot of designers nowadays tend to just create a word mark. Often it's a sans serif, I think that you call it, and no symbol at all. So that a brand often doesn't have very much, just the color and a font by which to do lots of things, on social media to try to look like itself, and it hasn't got very much. I mean, when would you decide to create a symbol as well and give a brand some extra elements to use?
It's such a good question, and it's so relevant today. If you'd asked me that 10 years ago, I would have said, well, they don't have to have a symbol. But now, if I am stuck in situations where I have 12 pixels to deal with, and it's a square space on Instagram or any other kind of a social media platform, I can't jam a word in there, right? So I'm going to need some sort of a symbol that can be a stand-in in some way. And of course, the tricky part with symbols is building equity over time. That you can't just launch the Apple logo by itself. You've got to have that combination. But I like this idea, especially now, of having detachable symbols and word marks, so that I have a very clear word mark that is proprietary, and then I have a symbol, but they can come apart. So I can use one by itself or the other. It gives you a little bit more flexibility in this world where I might have to have something tiny on an iPhone or gigantic on the side of a building.
Yeah. Well, often all these elements like colors, symbols, sounds, are protectable ultimately as intellectual property. So, I mean, I believe that you shouldn't create things without knowing how you're going to be able to protect it.
Fantastic point. Yes.
But often designers are not trained at all in intellectual property, and they tend to create and then leave it to the client to protect it. So the two are quite divorced from each other, which can cause problems sometimes,
Yeah, absolutely. I find that, I always work with an intellectual property attorney to help first do a search. Like if I'm working on an identity, I was like, I can't be alone responsible for tracking down something that may be infringing. I'd like to know, or there's a logo out there that looks identical to that already. And one little trick, and since you're a solicitor, you know this already, but in my contracts, I make it very clear that the client has the final responsibility to determine any violations of infringements, because I do not have the enormous resources
Yeah.
that someone like Disney might have to
No,
track
you
them
shouldn't
down.
need to, but the point is more that there's an ownability question and then there's the availability. So
Mhm.
obviously for availability, you need somebody to do the search, but you can also do some yourself, but you can put the onus on the client. But the ownability aspect is something maybe that I think designers would do well to learn IP to understand more
Yeah,
about. And I'm just
absolutely.
wondering whether your college teaches IP to, as part of, presumably people take an option like brand identity.
Mhm.
Is it taught as part of that at all or not? I guess not, but
No, it is actually.
is it?
It's
Yeah.
as complicated as it is. And I would love to say, oh, IP law, it's simple. No, it's not. It's obviously like very complicated and subjective.
Yeah.
And no, in our branding courses, it's definitely part of it. Like we actually do have an IP attorney come in and do a lecture and talk about, the issues involved. And then before they graduate, every student has to go through Business 101. And in Business 101, I think we spent a good 4 weeks on intellectual property issues.
Oh,
Um,
good. Hmm.
Mostly, strangely enough, it's actually the reverse. You would think that students are infringing left and right. And of course, they do at times, they have no idea. But often they'll claim ownership of something that can't be claimed.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I have a blue square. I did it. It's
Yeah.
mine. Yeah,
Yeah.
good luck with that. That's a lot. You can't forbid anyone from using blue squares for the rest of history, right?
Yeah.
So that becomes, they understand, oh, that's not actually a copyrightable form, or it is
Yeah.
copyrighted, but that's
Yeah.
not, I can't own that. It's
Yeah.
too broad.
Yeah. Actually, that reminds me. In design, you're looking for cues that are well known to
Mhm,
symbolize something. So if you're trying to explain wheat or cereal, you
mhm.
might well go for yellow to denote that.
Right.
Is that right? But that actually means it's not going to be ownable. So there's a tension between what you're trying to do as a designer and what you actually need to do to be able to have an ownable color, which is
Mhm.
not to use that yellow. So how do you navigate that? Mm.
It's one of those big problems as a designer that you have to face, and there's times when it's simply undeniable. You cannot get around it.
Mm.
Um, for example, I did an identity for a theater. It was a Roy and Disney Cal Arts Theater. The acronym was Red Cat. Well, I
Mhm.
had to use red. It sort of goes without saying. You're going to have to use
Yeah.
some shade of red. But at the same time, sometimes those rules need to be broken. So,
Mm.
for example, Wells Fargo Bank is red and yellow. That's their brand colors. Before they did that, red was completely verboten in any financial institution. You
Mhm.
could not use red. It meant you're in the red.
Yeah.
So it was like everything had to be blue or green. Like that was it. And
Yeah.
they rightly said, let's challenge that and own it. And
Mm.
they were able to. And turned out, well, that was sort of a silly rule. But they made that leap. But of course, there are those times when you're like, it is what it is. I can't. You don't want an identity to ever feel forced.
Mm.
Like you're jamming some idea in there that won't work. And in those cases, I remind people of identities that are so simple they're almost not ownable.
Mm.
H&R Block, I think, for example, has a green square.
Mm.
That's not ownable. The
Mm.
world it lives in is ownable.
Yeah.
So what kind of images I use, what
Mm.
kind of form and shape and colors are part of the system.
Mm.
Those start to actually tell the bigger story and can carry more ownership as a whole.
Yeah. Um, when do you think it's ever appropriate to completely redesign the visual identity, like this design you showed?
Mhm.
When would it be appropriate for, say, a new designer coming along to decide, actually, I want to change everything?
The first thing that I, of course, we tell our students to also, we have one class which is identity design, and they've got to redesign it. It's like you got to learn how to make a logo from scratch.
Yeah.
The next class in the series is actually strategy and research, and in that, the big part of it is how much equity exists in the mark they have, and is it good equity? Is it Coca-Cola has what 120 years of equity in that identity, and it's worth something like $1.5 billion. So clearly changing the Coke logo, bad idea. You can change the world around it, but that's something that really can't be done. Whereas there are times when an organization has completely changed and it's not the same structure, it's not the same goals, and it doesn't make the sense to maintain the same identity. The thing I always go back to, though, is how much equity exists. Is it worth it? I was working with a major corporation recently, and their identity was truly forgettable. Like, I honestly could not remember it every time someone mentioned it, and they insisted everyone knows our logo. And I'm like, what is it? What? I'm a designer, I can't remember it. They see it every day, so they assume, well, everybody sees it every day. But in reality, it sort of took like, okay, let's go ask some people. And it was really like going out on the street and saying, hey, what's the logo for so-and-so? And people were like, I don't know, what is that? And they hear that 3 or 4 times. They're like, okay, I got it. We don't have any equity in our logo. We've just, lost it. So I think if there's a tonal shift that has to occur, if something awful has happened, and there definitely needs to be an adjustment that we acknowledge something awful happened and we are a different company, then that has to occur. But in all of the big brand programs I've worked on, I've pretty much tried to either resurrect the original logo, which had equity and was abandoned for some reason, or find a way to make it more stable.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think I've been on various branding courses, and they talk a lot about differentiation and business strategy, but say absolutely nothing about what designers should actually do when they're creating the designs. So you get incidents like the Tropicana redesign, where they redesigned the packaging and got rid of all the sort of recognizable elements. And I wonder if that comes from designers not being trained in actually that, people have to recognize you still, that, there's a value in just them remembering that, you're yellow, or that your font is an italic rather than whatever, and not changing it. I mean, all these very famous brands have all changed their logos, like Saint Laurent, and they've all gone to this plain sans serif, is it?
Yeah, believe me, I've had some of my identities changed, and I'm like, why did they change it? It was fine. It had equity. And in a couple of instances, they actually went back. They realized it just did not work. And okay, that was a failure. Let's go back to the original. I wish more designers spent more time actually thinking about the business goals and the audience perception, as opposed to, can I make something neat? Like, can I make something really cool? And of course, as form makers, we love to do that. That's great, right? But unfortunately, that's, in some ways, it's like going to the doctor and the doctor tells you, okay, God forbid you have cancer, right? And you just keep saying, oh, no, I'm just going to do nose job. That's all I need. That's forget the rest. Well, the problem's systemic and probably bigger than just the logo. And trying to make a groovy new logo is not going to solve the bigger problems. Understanding those and then saying, okay, here's the biggest problem. You have terrible customer service. How can we adjust that? And how can I communicate? And that probably has nothing to do with the logo. It's probably has to do with, like, well, what's the message we're putting out there and how do we change it?
Yeah. And would you actually go to the customers, the target customers, to see if they like the logo? I mean, with this design you showed, or do you just show it to the client, and if the client likes it, then that's fine? Or how do you go about finalizing your choice?
It's a lot of that also depends on the size of the client.
Mhm.
In this instance, Meander is a small inn and hotel, and
Yeah.
there's with them it was very specific. They were the client. They knew the brand, and of course, we did have like a little dinner where we sort of previewed it and just to get people's reactions, but certainly a larger identity. I did the most recent one for Disney XD, which is a television channel, a
Mm.
network. And with that, there was focus group testing for 2 months of bringing in groups of like 12-year-old boys and asking them, what do you think? What do you think about this color system? What do you think about that color system? And getting their responses. Now, in that instance, I actually found that the person leading the focus groups had more sway than anyone in the room and could push things in the direction that maybe was not as objective as it could have been. And but in the end, the focus group did actually help for more to reinforce to the client that is the right choice. That is the response we're looking for.
Yeah. I find it as a client of designers very difficult to be able to know why they've actually made the choices they've made. In my very first visual identity, they gave me all those different fonts, like you said, hundreds and hundreds, and I just liked one, and I said, "Oh, that one's good," and then they worked on that. Is it a matter of what the client's taste is, or why choose one rather than another font?
Well, I mean, that's why I really hammer on those attributes, that before anything is made visually, before anyone does any sketching, before anyone tries anything, you work out what are those 6 or 7 words that define us. What are they? Now, then I can actually show you, okay, here's 5 typefaces. If this clearly is too clinical, clinical is not one of our attributes. This one is historical, and that is one of our attributes. This one is too contemporary, and that's what we're trying, so then at least the client has rational reasons, and you as a designer actually are making rational choices, not just like, what's the groovy typeface du jour? It's like, well, this is something we are trying to communicate. And I mean, I have had instances where I've shown an identity to clients and they've said, oh, I don't like it. And he said, okay, we'll explain, because these are the attributes that we worked on. Which one does it not hit? And they'll look at it and say, well, it does hit all of them actually. And like, okay, well, why don't you like it? Is there still something inherently they're responding to? Because maybe there is something there. Like if you're not responding and it's your company, is there something you're not telling me? Like, is there an attribute we have not discovered yet? Right. And do they need to be adjusted? Or, in that instance, the client did look at all of them and in the end said, well, my husband didn't like that blue. And I'm like, well, does that invalidate any of these? No, it doesn't. That's the right choice. Now it became more of a logical, rational choice, not a, well, I took it home and it looked bad in the light.
Yeah. That's interesting. So how can one tell whether the designer is good or not? I mean, how would you know whether you've got a designer who's talented or not talented?
Thinking it through. The first thing is, what you respond to, right? Like you are going to have a specific set of ideas that you look at and say, gee, I like that, or I don't like that. And that's important. And designers are not interchangeable cogs. They are people with life experiences, and that experience creates a vision that is in their work, like it or not. They're going to have a vision of some sort. Finding someone that's like-minded is really important. That you're like, yeah, that person shares my sensibilities. Like I'd like to think my sensibilities tend to be towards, I like things honest and straightforward. I like things to be legible and understandable. Someone who wants something avant-garde and oblique will hopefully never come to me. They'll just be unhappy. So finding someone who, I share that I like their stuff. And then if they're asking you the right questions, Like, the time to run for the door is when someone is like immediately sitting with you and you're trying to explain your company and or your organization, and they're like, it could be a tree. And they're like,
Mm.
okay, you don't even know who I'm talking to yet.
Yeah.
Like, you need to ask me, like, what am I about? Where am I trying to go? Why am I unique? Who's my competition? It's a great opportunity for most people to actually really think about their own organization or company and separate it, because we're always in so much of a process of doing business. We don't have time to stop and think, what does make me unique? Like,
Yeah.
why am I better than Betty down the street? What do I make? What's my product better or different? And how can I work on that?
Yeah. And then how do you choose the color apart from
Again,
being different to
well,
competitors?
color, I mean, Shireen, that is such a loaded question. I would love to say, in a perfect world, we go to the attributes and people are like, yes, this, that equals red, or that equals orange, or whatever it is. Color is so subjective. Like, for all I know, you were locked in an orange closet as a child, and you're never going to accept orange no matter what. There's just, so in some ways, that's where as a designer you have to be a little flexible, and you can provide people with, here's the rational reasons, here's the competition, here's all the logic, and that may still fail. Someone may still say, I absolutely hate orange, and in that case, okay, we can work with that. Let's move on to the next one.
Yeah.
It's I had one client, and he insisted his identity had to be the color of green was the choice in the end. It made perfect sense for the brand, but he wanted it to be the color of his Jaguar, and I was like, okay, so you have a green Jaguar, and I actually got the paint chips from that year and did it, and he's like, that's not my green. I'm like, okay, help, that is the exact same paint color. And it was like, well, no, it doesn't look like that. And of course, he's seeing it in a different light. So in his mind, there was a different green entirely. And it was like paramount that he get that green. And, in the end, it was like, here's the swatch book. You tell me which green is your green.
Yeah. So doesn't it signify something, the choice of color? I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
And understanding what colors mean culturally is I it's part of your job as a designer. I need to know I'm working in a Western country and white probably means purity or, cleanliness. Or if I'm working in an Asian country, it might mean death. I need to be aware of those
Yeah.
differences. I had a friend who was working on Japan Airlines, and she said at one point they made a presentation of the latest identity, and everyone in the room stood up and left angrily. And later on, someone said, that's a Chinese red. That's not the Japanese red. And it was so understanding culturally, what are these associations? What do they mean? What do they have to that? It's important. We respond to color, in different ways. And I mean, one of the things I mentioned in my last book, of course, is that people respond to bright, happy colors because they're easy to understand and easy to articulate. And typically they meant good things, that we wouldn't die from eating that bad brown thing. It doesn't look like rotten meat. It's probably good. But there are times when something more complex does make better sense. I think a Land Rover in bright red is, I'm sure someone might like that, but it seems, rather to be going against the brand, where something like a more complex avocado green is probably a better choice. That I would expect that it would feel more like, oh, I could take that on safari. It'd be perfect.
Great. So semiotics is that taught in your college?
It is. I don't know if anyone pays attention, frankly, but
Yeah.
you hope it is. And as I often tell people, it may not seem like they're getting it right now, but 5 years out, they will. Like, it's like, we're not training them for their first job. We're training them for their second and third. Because so much, they're just being fire hosed with so much information, but just getting them to understand, like, especially with color, if I call that avocado, someone is invariably going to say, oh, no, I hate that color. If I call it dark olive green, they're like, oh, I love that. So it's just those strange associations that can drive something. And definitely, just in terms of language semiotics, yes, that's critical. Like, what are the words you're using to describe something?
Mhm.
But also visual semiotics, like what's the subtext here? What do you've made this identity. Is there a subtext here, like that maybe you're not aware of? And that's, I think, where a little bit we start tipping into the world of responsibility, of designers' responsibility culturally, that what we make is public, what we produce goes out there and has a public voice. Knowing we're doing no harm is a really good thing to know.
Mm. Right. So what are some challenges facing designers at the moment?
The funny thing is, I was talking to someone about this. You have such good questions. I have to say, I was talking to someone last week about this. One of my students who graduated about 5 years ago has gone to work for one of the big tech companies, and he came back for a visit. And we had lunch, and he was explaining this project he was working on, which was a branding software. So basically, you would tell the software, "This is the name of my company. Here's the thing, my values, what it's about. Here's my competition," and it would generate a logo for you, and it would generate all the materials and a standards manual. So no human being would have to be involved at all. It would be completely artificial intelligence making all the choices for you. And he showed me some examples. I'm like, those are absolutely good examples. That is the right solution. The thing that it missed, though, was that sometimes the wrong solution is the right solution. That it could only give you what you put into it. So that the software couldn't come back and say, "I think your audience is wrong." Like, it just spat back what it was given. And I think the challenge now for designers is to not just mechanically go through the process, but to really stop and ask those hard questions. Is that the right audience? Like, I had a client who the audience kept aging up. Like, 1 year, for 5 years, it was 45 to 55, then 55 to 65. Like, your audience is dying. Let's just face it. Like, maybe we need to transition to a younger audience. So I think it's the designer's job really to ask those hard questions that no one really wants to be asked. Like, is that the right product that you're making? A great example of that I give to our graduate students is there's an amazing case study from Harvard, Marketing Myopia. And Marketing Myopia talked about the railroad industry in the 1800s, and the railroad industry was king. Like, obviously, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, they made their fortune. By the 1930s, they were basically out of business because air travel had taken over. Now, if the railroad companies had not defined themselves as railroad companies, but as travel or transportation companies, they could have made that transition.
Yeah.
But they were so singularly focused. So often I think it's our job as a designer to say, okay, are you more than what you say you are? Let's really dig into this and get to the bigger picture and solve that. And artificial intelligence can't do that. It's not, as of now, until it becomes sentient, I imagine. But, so I think that's our biggest challenge, is not knowing how to make things lovely, but how to ask the right questions and how to challenge when needs to be challenged.
Yeah. Well, I think also designers could differentiate themselves by properly understanding intellectual property, because I've got a course that I'm teaching at the moment, and I'm getting some really positive feedback from people who were just not aware how deeply IP impacts branding. It's not just, are we infringing or not? It's, what can be protected as a differentiator. For example, if you've got a patent, you have protection for your differentiation for a while, but you have to use your distinctiveness, your name, colors, whatever, to become known by them during that period while you've got that protection. A lot of companies that have patents make the mistake of just using a name like windsurfer for their instead of giving themselves a brand name as well as a description of that thing. So it's, I think if a designer understood all this when they're helping such a company to create the brand, then they'd be different to a lot of other designers who don't take account of the IP dimension, maybe.
It's so critical. It's just such a big part of it. And understanding, am I making forms that are copyrightable? Am I not? Are they not? If they're not, what else can I do? What other levels of protection can I put? Because it's, at least in the United States, and I'm sure it's based on British law also, is there's just levels of protection. That's like, yeah, I made it. I own the copyright to it now. Do I register it as a trademark? It's like, what are the different levels? And you need a really good IP attorney to navigate that. It is not something for the faint of heart.
Well, I think you don't necessarily just need an IP attorney. You need to know what you're creating when you're creating it. And then, yes, you get an IP attorney. Like what you said, description isn't what you're trying to do when you're naming something. But so many branding people actually go for description rather than naming something.
Naming it. And the funny thing is, too, is like
marketing.
That the SEO, the search engine optimization value of something unique is so much better than windsurfing company, which will bring up 1,000. But if I've got a very specific, if I've got, Adam's windsurfing company, I've got a better chance of the search engine optimization moving that forward. And I mean, we hammer that even on web pages. Name every page individually and specifically. It's so important.
Well, you know that, but so many designers don't, because they come and ask me, "Can I protect this?" And it's just a very blatant description. I think, no, you can't protect it. But the fact that they even ask makes me think you need training in to understand what is ownable as a name.
Yeah, what's ownable and what's not, and they're just understanding, like, well, it's important to create something proprietary. That's what you're being paid for, is something that's that client can then own it. And some things, like we discussed, are maybe not as proprietary as others, but there's ways of working on that to make it even more so. Even if it's those slight things that we talked about, like, okay, I'm making some modifications to that letter form so that it stands out, like the tail on the R. Okay, that's memorable. That's going to be a little different. And now, granted, if push comes to shove, if I put that in front of a judge, they'd say, no, absolutely, I don't see any difference at all. But, at least you're starting to make that attempt that, along with the rest of the identity system, it starts becoming unique.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much. Before we stop, can I just ask, are there some resources like books or conferences or podcasts that you'd recommend to delve more into this topic that you spoke about today?
The Design Management Institute is a great organization that deals with a lot of these more critical issues as opposed to just form making. DMI, they do a great job. AIGA, American Institute of Graphic Arts, also has a really good arm that deals with the business side of this and intellectual property. The British Design and British D&AD is fantastic at the same thing as an organization, at understanding that it's not just about making things look a certain way, but understanding how do we protect things. All of these different organizations, basically, many of them were formed at the beginning of the 19th century when it was sort of a copyright festival, a free for all of things being imitated and copied, as a way to really say, look, we need to set some standards. So I think they're fantastic. One of my good friends, Debbie Millman, is an amazing writer, and I always think any of Debbie's books are totally worth digging into.
Your own book, of course.
Oh, and my book, thank you. Yes.
You've got a follow-up coming.
Yeah, and I do actually have a course on LinkedIn Learning on branding, and
Ah,
Yeah, and so that one's that one. Strangely enough, it's on LinkedIn Learning, it's like a rating system. Like you have different courses, and for a long time, a few of the courses were always just doing gangbusters, and lately the branding one's just gone nuts. And
ah.
I assume there's a lot of interest out there, and I'm hoping people are actually getting the not how do I make this pretty, but how do I ask the real questions and create something that's unique.
Yeah. Oh, I'll put that in the show notes. And how can people contact you or learn from you? Where's the best place for them to look out for you?
You can find my own website, www.seanadams.design is
Mhm.
a good place to go. Artcenter.edu is another place where you can find me. And Amazon, of course. I think I have something like 8 books at this point. So they're still all in print. And,
Great. Wow.
I do like that. The one that we talked about, I think that would be really relevant is the Designer's Dictionary of Color. And that one I really did try to tackle, okay, what are some of the emotional issues connected with color and the cultural issues, and how do we work with those?
Oh, okay. We'll write it in the show notes. Great.
Yeah,
Well,
thank
thank you
you.
very much indeed, Sean.
My pleasure. And someday I hope to visit. Like I told you in my email, it's one of my places I've always wanted to go. So you're
Oh,
lucky to live.
well, look me up if you do come.
I will. I'll come to Hastings to do my historical tour and come and see you too.
Thank you very much.
My
Bye.
pleasure. Thank you, Shireen. Thank you.
That's it for this week. Do subscribe to the Brand Tuned newsletter to get weekly updates. I'd also love to get your feedback. Just send me an email to info@brandtune.com. Finally, if you liked the episode, please do share it with your friends and colleagues and review it on iTunes or whichever platform you use to listen to podcasts. If you leave us a 5-star review, it means more people will listen and we can spread the word much more quickly about the podcast. Thank you and bye for now.